Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. Continued from Conan the Cunning, story so far. Now, things had not exactly been going swimmingly in the camp of the mighty Cunning War, and that was quite the understatement. For without their lord, their master, their chief, without Conan, it had evolved into a brawl of unexpected brutality. Well, to say that brutality was unexpected is a bit much, I suppose, as that is truly the orky thing to be, after all. Was it not Gork himself that said, "To be cunning is to be orky, to be brutal is to be divine"? Or was it Mork? Oh well, some things are inscrutable, lost in the sands of time. Like why it was necessary to have grots, let alone snots, in so many numbers. Yet it was a hard truth that no war could exist without an abundance of these seemingly pointless creatures. When I say pointless, but that again is a bit of an exaggeration, for grots and snots did indeed taste delicious, and were as a second food staple, after the mighty and useful squigs, of course. Well, the ones for eating, the common garden squig, as every youth knows that there are a multitude of different breeds of squig, and some are definitely not for the eating. Like, if you were to go and attempt to eat a boom or sploding squig, well, it would not bode well for your dentures to do so. Of that I can assure you. Nor would the consumption of a weird squig do one's mental faculties any good, and dining on bowel torrent squigs is a most unpleasant and messy affair. Now the snots were having a hard time unto themselves, as the grots were more than willing to share their woes with their diminutive cousins. And what woes they were! The grot numbers had only just returned to normal after their excessive use in the last month, lines dead marking no think zones, and the popular craze of origgrotmy, of course, their use in mass cogitations. Now this last element was what had caused their most recent plight, for it was simple and plain to all orcs worthy of the name. Their chief, their boss, Conan the Cunning, was so mighty, so cunning, that it was ludicrous to believe that he had made any error in his strategic and tactical acumen and understanding of his situation. But Conan had been captured by a lucky hit from the despicable enemy warboss, Tooth Smasher. Hence it was posited by the greater Waaghs that the error could not be his. Ergo, it must be the fault of those around him. And all now looked for the root cause. For there to be a proper lynching, the cause would have to be something smaller and less fighty than those knobs and bosses at the top. For they would probably make any lynch mob scatter swiftly when they unleashed their might. Not that orcs would avoid a fight, of course. That would be blasphemy, a profanity to the very spirit and beings of their gods, Gork and Mork. More to put it, that rage that needed releasing also had to be done so in a way that did not utterly destroy the Waaghs. Hence it was that some bright spark put it about that it was surely the fault of the grots. Had Conan not used them in his deliberations, his planning and scheming, his mighty cogitations? Had he not used them to augment his cunning? Therefore, if the thinking had failed, then surely it was the fault of the treacherous grots who were supposed to be helping. Had they secretly conspired to be less effective, to cripple or confuse the Great One's ventures? And from this simple decision, a bloodbath ensued. But this time, the grots seemed to be ready for it. None knew quite why. their response, to attempt to satiate the orcs' rage on others. Hence it was that the grots took a bit of a steer from their orky masters and performed metasnotosis. It was the changing of the snots on a fundamental level to make them appear like grots. For the few bright sparks in the grots hoped that the massacre might only go on for so long. Thus they would give the orcs something to take out their wrath on. The runt herds were actually quite important, you see, so they were more involved in the greater struggles for dominance. So it was mostly the youths that were hunting down and punishing the grots, and these youths were far less discerning than the older, more mature orcs. And it was not long before the fringes of the camp were exposed to the spectacle of smaller youth orcs chasing around snots that had undergone metasnotnosis. Now some might think that the stapling of multiple snots together and rolling them in rags or rugs so that only the top snot's head and the bottom snot's feet protruding from their wrappings would not fool even a youth. But it was dark. It was a time of war. It was pandemonium. And, if we can be honest, which I always hope to be, the youths were not too bothered if it were actually snots or grots in the first place, for they were doing little more than performing a minor play. A copy of the greater confrontation that was transpiring in the camp centre. For while bonfires of snots and grots lit the edges of the camp, the centre was a thing of horror, or hilarity, depending on your worldview. Most involved thought it was indeed the latter, as the elements of the Conan War fell on each other. It started when, in the absence of Conan, who had surely been slain by now, Git Squisher McMurder proclaimed himself the new big boss. A mistake, to be sure. For this elicited an immediate response from Madna Kunkelstein, of course, who then began to use his mighty foot of Gork indiscriminately on the camp. Huge spectral feet, hundreds of meters in size, slamming down all over the camp, crushing all beneath them. But being candid, this did slay many an orc, but it was more for show, really. It was scary, to be certain, but it didn't do half the amount of damage to the numbers that it may have looked, and Git Squisher was well aware of this. It was for scaring humies, really, but it certainly added to the confusion in the camp. Now the situation got worse very swiftly, as these sort of things are wont to do in a large congregation of orcs. For the larger bosses and their knobs were seeing a golden opportunity that may never come again, and it was no exaggeration to say that near 1 in 3 bosses now believed they could take the war for themselves. Git Squisher was very effective, of course, but he was no Conan. Certainly not in cunning, for no orc but the prophet himself was, but nor in size or brutality either. And so the camp broke into a score of fighting bosses, all attempting to win Conan's golden chair, his golden thong, for themselves. And without Conan and his bodyguard, his Black Legion, to regain control, the war was literally tearing itself apart. Which many agreed was what Gork and Mork would have wanted, and it was hilarious to boot, especially when employing said boot to the head of other orcs, of course. But there was one orc who did not see the amusement, did not see the opportunity. He saw the death of the war. For Conan had taken him deep into his council, whatever that means, and had revealed his suspicions about the other war, the speed war of Tooth Smasher. The red hue to some of the skins of the envoys they had received, which was unorky in the extreme. Both the merest existence of the embassage and the harrowing mutation of some of the orc's skin to that reddish hue, which could only mean one thing. These vile heathens had turned their backs on Gork and Mork. They were milksops who turned to chaos. And if that were true, then the speed bar would inevitably fall. It was how these things went. And so it was that Dhaka von Smashhoven acted. He would not allow his people to be drawn down into the dung heap of worshipping weak and pitiful gods of humies and pointies. No, he would act. Thus it was that Dhaka von Smashhoven left the camp mid-crumpin. Many of his closest adherents had forwarded that it was he that should be contending for the place of boss of bosses, but he had just ignored this charge from his flyboys, and told them to move their vehicles as far from the main ward as possible until he returned. There was some disappointment and no small measure of annoyance, to be certain, but after a few decapitations and clumpings, he had persuaded them of the merit of his plan, and the winds of war hopped into their cockpits and relocated. Well, after dropping a few bombs on the camp as they flew over. But they did not want to be entirely without any action in the air. Action. So, as Dhaka von Smashoven took his last look down at the Conan War, he was both entertained and slightly vexed in equal measure when he saw the carpet bombing his flyboys enacted on the camp. But he had to conclude that it was worth it after all, because it did create such huge explosions and fire and fun, boys flying in the air and entire swathes of the camp ablaze, a sight to warm the cockles of the heart. Dhaka then turned and went on his dark way, a shadow in the night, because to find shadows, one had to become a shadow oneself. Hence it was that Dhaka von Smashoven crept into the foreboding forests nearby in hunt for the hunters. It was not actually that long before he was found, for it was definitely he who was found by the orcs he was coming to see, not the other way around. Dhaka von Smashoven had walked and stalked for hours, but had seen hide nor hair of the orcs he was attempting to locate. He now stood on a rather convincing grassy knoll, his face beaming up at the two moons that leered down at him, basking in their light, when he heard a rustle. Now he may have heard the rustle, but he was soon to discover that this was just a way of gaining his attention, for as he turned to face the source of the disruption, he was confronted by a wall of green. Standing right next to him, fanning out behind in a seeming forest of their own, were huge orcs covered in branches and muck, dung and slime, all so that they were indeed utterly camouflaged against their backdrop. It was as if the woods had sprung to life and just materialized behind him, and somewhere Tolkien was happy. Von Smashoven was acutely aware that he was only alive because someone had recognized him. It could have been the proximity of so many previously invisible boys. It could have been the way they stood back from him with a tiny bit of war. Or it could have been their leader, who belched hard and stated, "We would have slit you good if you weren't the great Dhaka von Smashoven." At that, the air was filled with an eruption of gaseous bottom burps, as each of the orcs had been holding in their flatus while hiding from this intruder to their realm. Their leader had spoken. They had all stood and revealed themselves, so the need for disguise was gone. Hence was the night broken, with a sound like a chainsword being let off during the silence of a sermon. Dhaka von Smashoven did not choke, no matter how chewy the air had become. He did not wince or even comment, as the combined expulsions assailed his nostrils and confronted his very eyes. He was a boss, and bosses did not gag or choke on mere flatulence alone. When the welcome breeze rustled more of the leaves and, thankfully, blew away their miasma, he spoke. He spoke of honor, of orkiness, of the enemy and of cunning, of how their lord Conan had not been beaten as long as there were any who held his name as their guide. Of course, this phenomenal display of eloquence was utterly lost on the wide-eyed drooling commandos, so he then tried a more direct tack. Knowing that the intellect of the commandos was actually quite formidable for his race, he realized it was just the angle he had chosen, the vectors of his oratory sallies that had been at fault. Thus it was that he prevailed upon them to follow him in his schemes, by stating simply, "Do yous wanna go raid in the other camp then?" As predicted, this did the trick. Such potent enticements could not be ignored, and the commandos all sniffed and nodded in agreement, and then went about gathering their number from the surrounding forests. It was then an odd factor that Dhaka noted, for at his side also appeared a huge ball with teeth. He was easily recognizable as the largest and meanest and bitiest of all the squigs in the entire war. It was none other than Tiddles himself, the pet of Conan the Cunning. Sniffing the area around Dhaka von Smashoven, Tiddles cocked his leg and mocked him. Now, this was not something that Conan would have ever permitted, of course, but Dhaka was almost brought to tears by the loyalty and passion of this squig. He had mocked Dhaka. Did Tiddles know? sense on some instinctive level that he was attempting to save his master, to rescue Conan. The foot he belted into the squig was just enough to let him know who was actually boss, but not enough to indicate that he actually wanted a fight. The squig, large as it was, took the hoofing without complaint, and merely growled at Dhaka von Smashoven for a moment to make certain no more chastisements were coming in his direction. And thus it was that Dhaka von Smashoven was soon travelling across the plains and forests of Aquilonia, with multiple thousand commandos in tow. Tiddles, previously known as Nutcruncher, at his side. He would strike at the speed war and try to work out if Conan was still alive. He had to be. For the survival of all orcs on Aquilonia, for the greater war, for the honour of the great gods Gork and Mork. He had to be. Continued after the law. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and units of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And at the dawn of Orktober, we go into one of the most interesting of all of the Ork units, one that has recently been re-released in all their glory, with new models that fit their aesthetic and activity down to the very ground. Of course, I can only be talking of the Ork Kommandos. And so, as usual, for the very basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote, Commandos. Commandos epitomize the Orky virtue of low cunning. Nothing makes a commando happier than creeping up on an unsuspecting enemy, his mates slithering through the undergrowth at his side. When the time is right, the commandos will burst from their hiding places, slashing, stabbing, and shooting at their stunned prey before they have a chance to strike back. Commandos are viewed with suspicion by the majority of boys. On the rare occasions they are viewed at all. These specialists do not socialize with other greenskins. They sometimes go into self-imposed exile for months at a time, and in more extreme cases, even permanently, divorce themselves from their tribe. Commandos prize intelligence and initiative, as some of them are even able to read. Not for them the thrill of a mass charge or a turbo-powered race to the front line in a badly made truck. Instead, a commando gets his kicks from slitting throats and spreading panic behind enemy lines before launching a perfectly timed ambush. The horrified look on the faces of their prey, who assume they would be able to see their orc attack a mile off, is tremendously rewarding to the members of a commando mob. These scare tactics are epitomized by Snexrot of the Red Skull Commandos, whose name is a byword for terror upon Armageddon. On the field of battle, commandos will assassinate sentries and destroy gun emplacements to give the rest of the lads a better chance of reaching the enemy lines unscathed. It is common for each commando to have a specialist role within the mob and have a nickname appropriate to this role, such as Fireboy or Throat Slit. This organized and militaristic outlook means that young Stormboys often develop into commandos, instead of rejoining the right-thinking Orc boys at the heart of each warband. The tools of the commando's trade are subtle by Orc standards. They place great faith in soot-blackened blades and camouflage, painting their skin with stripes of blood, dirt, and dung, so they blend in with their surroundings. This practice is shocking to a normal Orc, who considers the idea of covering up his greenness unnatural. Only the Blood Axes truly see the value of such caution. Some commandos are even more inventive with their camouflage, attaching foliage to their uniforms, or employing cunning disguises. Well, cunning by Orky standards anyway. Commandos do occasionally employ heavy weapons, which they reveal only when they are in position to cripple a battle tank or slaughter an enemy squad that has broken from cover. Boss Snickrot, the Green Ghost. The infamous Orc hunters of the Armageddon Imperial Guard are afraid of one orc, and one orc alone. In the dark nights of the equatorial jungles between Prime and Secundus, these grizzled veterans whisper tales of Bosnotskrit, the Stalker. They tell of a killer who slips through the jungle like a ghost, who can pass through throttle vine groves without disturbing a single leaf. They tell of a savage hunter who lives for vengeance, whose eyes blaze with the devilish light of hatred. Finally, they tell of his victims, left to bleed to death, with their eyes put out and their scalps ripped free from their skulls. Boss Snickrot was a commando in high regard at the time of Ghazghkul's original invasion, and his was amongst the first of the orc tribes to navigate the green hell that separates Armageddon Prime from Armageddon Secundus. The sea of jungle was vast, and Snickrot's commandos soon separated from the main tribe. Straying towards Cerberus base, the majority of his tribe fell foul of the Imperial Guard jungle fighting specialists stationed in the heart of the Verdant Realm. Snickrot ordered his boys to withdraw, vowing to conquer the environment before they turned their attention to the human bases. Snickrot had learned his lesson well. He pledged to fight a guerrilla war from the very heart of the jungle, stripping his kit down to the bare minimum so that the colour of his skin blended in with the jungle itself. He and his commandos became one with the tangled vegetation, their tough hides and strong metabolism giving them a natural resistance to the lethal defences of the nightmarish environment. Snickrot and his lads refined their already prodigious abilities in stealth and sabotage until they were able to slip into the Astra Militarum barracks and kill the residents in their sleep. Thus began a campaign of terror and psychological warfare that has plagued the Imperial war effort upon Armageddon ever since. Snickrot's Red Skull Commandos, so called because of their habit of scalping their victims and spreading the hot blood onto their own heads, were still at large when Ghazghkul returned 50 years later. By this time, the legend of Snickrot had spread to the furthest hives. Some spoke of a ghost who drank the blood of his victims in the dark of the night. Some told of a murderous beast who wore the dog tags of his numerous victims upon his chain-wrapped forearms so he could whisper their names to the jungle moon. Some told of his deadly knives, and how they tasted the throats of colonels, nobles, and courtesans alike. All across Armageddon, in the flickering twilight of the hives, mothers scare their children into obedience with stories about the stalker Snickrot. Each of the gruesome tales has a basis in truth. To this day, Snickrot is one of the most feared of all greenskins, and even the orc hunters pray to the Emperor that it is not their neck that Snickrot buries his knives in next. Of late, a surprising number of orcs have been given cause to hope for the same thing. With the demons of chaos spilling into Armageddon, Imperial and Greenskin forces have been compelled, in a few extreme cases, to temporarily set aside hostilities to fight off the greater threat. Snickrot is disgusted by such compromise, seeing it as weakness, and is quick to punish those orc leaders guilty of it. More than one knob has been dragged into the shadows, his severed head turning up on a spike shortly afterwards as a warning against mobbing up with humies. End quote. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you have enjoyed this brief introduction to Commandos, and know that there will be plenty more Ork content this month, in Orktober. Can't wait. Chains Grand especially, but it's proving to be quite a technical challenge, so apologies for the delays. If you have enjoyed my silly tales, then please consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. If you see the worth in what we are doing, then do also consider joining our Patreon, or giving the video a share if that is beyond your present scope. It would be a great boon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo. And back to the story. They had arrived. Dhaka von Smashhoven crept through the landscape along with a multitude of commandos, Magnus the Strangler, their leader, at his side. Magnus explained that usually there would be a lot of undergrowth for them to get even closer, but that something had disrupted the usual warp and weft of the land. Something had seemed to drain all of the vitality out of the foliage and other flora around the camp of the Speedwar. As Dhaka von Smashhoven looked around, he did indeed note the strangly and rather sad-looking scrub around him. It was as Magnus the Strangler had stated. It was now a dry and lifeless place, where before it had been so verdant. It seems that the Speedwar had more than a little nastiness hidden within it. But then, Dhaka knew exactly what was responsible, or, more to the point, whom. It was the leader of the Chaos Scum, their boss, Tober. His filth had permeated the very grounds, the very holy sod of Aquilonia. Not that Dhaka was a budding horticulturist or anything. In fact, he gave less thought to trees and grass than he gave to squigs, which was to say none at all. But it was a wonderful new reason to despise his opponents. For who really wants to crump anything if they do not despise it? Oh, the rush of the crumping is all well and good, but a lovely tinge of revenge, or hatred, added a certain je ne sais quoi to the entire activity. Not something to be missed, really. Well, not if one had tasted its heady draught before. And after all the victories that Conan had given to Dhaka von Smashhoven over the hated Humies, it was definitely something he now required to really enjoy the violence. And a debt he was not willing to ignore, no matter how his orky mind usually worked. It was for this reason alone that he was here, outside of his mighty craft of the skies, hunched over and covered in camouflage. Now Dhaka was not entirely sure that quite so much dung was required to attach the scant foliage he had been covered in previously, but his commando brethren had insisted it was just enough. Nor was he sure that the ritual of being spat on by every member of the squad was to his liking, to be accepted as one of them before the hunt, of course. But he figured he would never have to do this sort of thing again. And if he still felt aggrieved after they had regained Conan, well, later on, he could just round them up and put them in a field and bomb the commandos. And thus it was that they crept towards the camp. The commandos stealthily approached the pickets and made them disappear, knives dragging across jugulars in utter silence. They pushed on. Inside the enemy camp there was much celebration still going on, even after a few days. The elation of the victory over Conan was palpable. It made them sloppy. Of that Dhaka von Smashhoven was sure, for they had penetrated as far into the camp as is possible, without there being a mild squealing. Perhaps a poor choice of words, but it was how it was. As Dhaka von Smashhoven cleared the main buildings on his hands and knees, as were most of them, he espied a very excited Tiddles hoofing off towards the central section of the camp, and as he followed the cheeks of the squig disappearing into the distance, his eye was drawn towards a central tree, and a scene that filled him with both hope and fear in equal measure. For there he was, Conan. He still lived. Hope was still alive. But he was broken and beaten, and was hung unceremoniously from that central tree. Picking up pace, Dhaka and the commandos now broke into a jog, then a sprint, as they saw their target, and little betwixt them. They could do it. Alas, it was then that Tiddles managed to bump slap-bang into a huge red orc. The thing was near carried off its feet, but righted itself on a tent pole, and then looked at the fleeing, madly happy squig, only to then look at where it had come from, and he gazed directly into the eyes of Dhaka von Smashhoven. With no hesitation whatsoever, his jaw dropped and a huge bellow came out of it. The alarm had been rung out and was carried across the entire camp within minutes. And that was the end of that. For walls of red orc squigs and even gruts came pouring out of their tents and the broken old structures that they now infested and barreled towards the commandos like an avalanche. Despite putting up a valiant attempt to punch through, it was when Meganob and Flashgit, in their mega armor, appeared between their forces and Conan that they knew it was a lost cause. Despite how close they had come, they were not going to make it. Tiddles had avoided the oncoming wave of flesh and hidden in the camp, But Dhaka von Smashoven and his allies were not so fortunate, and took eye-watering casualties on their way back out of the camp and away into the night. But the speed war did not even chase them. They did not care to. They had Conan, and they had victory. They did not need to hunt down a few stragglers. And so it was that Dhaka von Smashoven trudged back to the camp, shoulders rounded and his step heavy. Now many would believe that this was due to his failure, but nothing could be closer to the truth, for he had seen his boss, knew he was alive. He knew he could get him out. He knew it. The thing that made his shoulders sag and his sighing so deeply was the thought of having to meet with the talker. Ugh. For none else could possibly perform the task he could not do himself. Hence, von Smashoven would have to meet and then entreat with Chains Grand, Ork of Mystery.